the young, shy man very respectful young man that I met then, was only beginning a very long, prolific and distinguished, as well as somewhat controversial career. Brij went on to teach at USP, University of Hawaii, where he co-founded the Journal of Contemporary Pacific, and then he spent much of his life buried in his office in the Coombs building at ANU, where of course he had many other roles. He was an editor of the Journal of Pacific History. He was chair of Pacific Manuscripts Bureau for a long time, and many other roles as well. Now, during the 1990s, Brij took time out from academia to serve as a commissioner on the Constitutional Review Committee, amongst other activities. And in 2015, Brij was awarded the Australian Medal, or Member of the Order of Australia, in the 2015 Queen's Birthday Honours. But back to 1978. 1978, of course, was only 8 years after Fiji became independent from British rule. So if anyone can talk about this through having lived through this phase, it's our dear friend Brij. But more so, Brij has studied, he's written and studied about decolonisation and about the political turmoil in Fiji. And as I said, he's had a very prolific output in his publications. But if you want to just get a taste of his work, I highly recommend his most recent publication, Levelling Wind, which is freely available to download off ANU Press.
Okay, good.
Other book that I always recommend is Brij's History of 20th Century Fiji, Broken Waves, and also his fiction, or is it faction? I'm not sure, but Mr. Tulsi's Store, A Fijian Journey. There's many other books, and I can't possibly, if I mentioned them all, I'd be taking up the whole of Brij's time today. But many books on Fijian history, historiography, politics, with such evocative titles as Islands of Turmoil, on elections and politics in Fiji. There's been biographies of A.D. Patel and J. Ram Reddy, and many other works. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce my dear friend and dear former colleague, because we used to teach together at USP. But before I hand it over to Brij, I'd just like to hand it back to Helen, because she's got a few words to say about housekeeping.
Yes, thanks very much, Jackie, and welcome everybody. Just very briefly, Brij will be speaking, I think, from between 30 to 40 minutes, and there will be about another 40 minutes for questions after that. Please make yourself familiar with the hand-raising function. You can find that in the participants option at the bottom of your screen. Brij, you don't need this. This is, and that way, because there's too many people to fit on one screen, I'll be able to see who it is that wants to ask the question. So I'll manage the question. So thanks very much to everybody, and I'm now passing over to Brij. This session is being recorded. Thank you. Thanks, Brij.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Jackie. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Namaskar. Nisa Bulavinaka. I hope that you and your loved ones are well and safe in these troubled and troubling times. Now, it's very tall order to be given 30 minutes to speak on a subject that has occupied me for the better part of my academic career, but I'll try. The second thing is that I retired some years ago. I'm out of practice in talking to captive audiences. So, and the second thing is that the Zoom technology is new to me. So I hope you'll bear with me as I touch on the main points of the subject, and we will explore the lanes and by-lanes of this narrative in question time. Now, in 2 days' time, Fiji will celebrate its 50th anniversary of independence from Great Britain after 96 years of colonial rule. There will be a national holiday. The worthy citizens of that country have gone up to Government House to receive specially commissioned 50th anniversary medals. And I read in the papers today that a special 50-cent coin is being minted to mark this event, and this 50-cent coin will be given free to students from year 1 to year 13, so that they can remember this great and glorious day. Total speeches will be given about what a wonderful history we
up and down
had in the last 50 years. But I hope you'll excuse me for raining on this parade by asking, what is it that we are celebrating this last 50 years? And are we not yet again indulging in our favorite national pastime of averting our eyes from the truths of our history and pretending as if really nothing happened? So I think I hope you'll bear with me as I take a more critical look at the last so many years. Now, the understandings and assumptions which underpinned the 1970 Constitution have been ignored, or worse, breached in the last 50 years. Now, we inherited the Westminster system of parliamentary democracy in Fiji in 1970, but that has been observed more in the breach than in its spirit or in fact over this period of time. We've had 3 coups to change governments in Fiji, 1987, 2000, and 2006. The military is very much the center of Fiji's constitutional structure at the moment, even though people don't realize what is happening. The Fiji military has the guardian role over the constitution. In other words, it can legitimately enter the political domain if the military feels that the constitution is in some way in danger. And that is the real elephant in the room. Indigenous institutions like the Great Council of Chiefs, which occupied a central role, important role in the 1970 Constitution, have been abolished by decree in 2009. And so a lot of these things that were taken for granted in 1970 have really fallen by the wayside. Now, if you go back to the 1970 Constitution, I think you'll find that it was a flawed, backward-looking document that institutionalized past practices and protocols of Fijian political life, rather than being an imaginative document that looked forward with progressive ideas about nation building and so on. Now, even as the document was being signed, people who knew about these things were aware of the deep flaws in the document. On 8th of October, 1970, in his last dispatch to London, Governor Sir Robin Foster wrote that while a lot of good things had happened and people had talked and cooperated and so on in arriving at the settlement. He said that, in quotes, a time bomb lies buried in the 1970 Constitution. A time bomb lies buried. That is, none of the deep underlying issues that had divided people the last or previous decade or more had been resolved. Nothing about the sharing of power, electoral system, the land lease system, and so on. But he hoped that some of these problems would be resolved or diffused before the bomb exploded. Now we know what happened in '87 and so on and so forth. So even at that time, there was recognition that this was a flawed document. Now, let me go back and see how we arrived at this, looking at the negotiations that took place throughout the discussions that took place in the 1960s. The story begins really with 1960, when a new lattice patent dealing with the composition and constitution of the Legislative Council arrived in Fiji. It promised many changes, complete adult franchise. The Fijian people, the Tokay, were given the right to vote for the first time. Women were given the right to vote for the first time. There were more unofficial elected members of the Legislative Council for the first time. So this was the 1960 lattice patent. Now, the last lattice patent had been in 1937. Nothing had changed. The Constitution hadn't changed in this period. And this was a period of a great change in Fiji. The Second World War, for example, the demographic changes which took place in this period, with Indo-Fijian population exceeding the indigenous population for the first time in the 1940s, as recorded in the 1946 census. There was growing awareness on the part of the government that the social and economic problems of the Fijian people had to be addressed if Fiji had to move forward. And to that end, the colonial government appointed Professor Oscar Spate of ANU to investigate the social and economic problems and prospects of the Fijian people, and he produced his report in 1959. Then in 1960 came Burns Commission report into population trends and natural resources of the country. Now, both these reports recommended fundamental changes in Fijian society. In Oscar Spate talked about more galala farming, independent farming, and so on. And Burns recommended integration of rural administrative structures, making them multiracial systems of administration. In 1959, there was a major industrial disturbance in Fiji, and in 1960, there was a massive strike in the sugar industry. So the late 1950s and early 60s were a troubled time in the history of Fiji. And the reason why I say this is one has to understand the context, the political and social and economic context that existed at the time when the new lattice patent arrived in Fiji. And it's interesting, the reaction of the three principal communities to the proposed changes proposed by the Colonial Office. Because you see, by the late 1950s, it was clear that colonialism was on its way out. Harold Macmillan's winds of change were beginning to reach the Pacific, with Samoa becoming independent in 1962, Cook Islands in 65, and so on and so on. And of course, it was India in 1947, which which marked the beginning of the end of colonial rule in the empire, with African colonies following suit in the mid-1950s and late 1950s. So change was inevitable, and it was with that sort of in mind that the government had introduced or proposed these changes. Now, the reaction of the three communities to the proposed changes was quite interesting. Let's take the response of the Fijian people, as represented by the folks in the Legislative Council. In the debate that took place in 1961 on the latest patent, you had Ratu Sepanai, or not, he wasn't Sir then, Ratu Panayang Ganilau, who said, look, this is a betrayal of the Fijian people. We never envisaged severing these ties with the UK. And Ratu George Dekambau, who was the paramount chief of Fiji, Gunivalu, he said, look, this is a betrayal, but if Fiji is going to move towards greater internal self-governance and independence, then please hand back Fiji to the Fijian chiefs who had ceded the islands to UK in the first place. Ratu Mara told American reporter Homer Bigart that Fiji had nothing to gain from independence. He said, we can't pay for anything. We can't even pay for our food. And in his own words, we are not as stupid as that to ask for independence. And I think, so there's a kind of resistance to any change, resistance to any change not authorized by the chiefs themselves, by the Fijian people themselves. And you have to understand the difficulties under which they were laboring at the time. I mean, there was lack of Fijian presence in the professional fields like law, medicine, and so on. In the public service too, there was underrepresentation of Itoke. So they said no. We don't want any changes, but if changes are going to come, then they will come on our terms. We must be consulted. The response of the Europeans was similar, and in fact, there's a coalition of interest between Europeans and Fijians, and part of the reason I forgot to mention is also the fear of Indian dominance. The fear of Indian dominance because, as I mentioned, after late 1940s, Indian population had exceeded the Fijian population. The Indian position was stated by A.D. Patel, who entered the Legislative Council in 1963 for the first time since 1948. And basically what Patel said was, look, independence is going to come to Fiji, if not today, then tomorrow, or day after. It's no use, behaving like King Canute. That's his expression, not mine. And he said that, look, the challenge facing Fijian people was not, it was whether independence was going to come as Durga, as Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, or as Durga, the goddess of destruction. And so they welcomed any prospect of change towards greater internal self-governance and eventual independence. So this is the situation in the early 1960s. Now, the Fijian people realized, the leaders realized that it was not really enough simply to say no to any proposal for change. They had to come up with a considered position, and that came with the Wakaya letter in 1964. Wakaya is an island, and this is where members of the Fijian Affairs Board, which was the executive arm of the Great Council of Chiefs. They met all the high chiefs, Ratu Dulta Ratu Mara, Ratu Panaya, the Secretary for Fijian Affairs, Archie Reed, and the legal advisor, John Farley. They met on the island and they formulated a series of proposals which they said would be preconditions to any further discussion on internal self-governance or political change more generally. Now, what were the terms stated in the Wakai letter? The first, well, not the first, but not in any particular order, but one was that the consent of the Great Council of Chiefs must be sought before any changes are announced. That there has to be guarantee on Fijian land ownership and other matters of interest to the indigenous community. That there should be a move towards creating racial balance in the civil service, and that Fiji should strive to become a Christian state. And for this, they went back to the preamble of the deed of cession in 1874, which said that one of the aims of colonization would be to promote civilization and Christianity. It didn't say that Fiji should be a Christian state, but that was by then the position of the Fijian chiefs. You see, the deed of cession becomes an important document for debate in the 1960s. Now, the thing is that the deed of cession was intended to be a protective document. In other words, a document the Fijian people would be given the right of say on matters of deep concern to them, to protect their institutions, practices, and so on. By the early 1960s and throughout the 1960s, it becomes what I might call assertive document, that for their interest to remain paramount, they must be in control of government. So that is in the Wakai letter, which, as I said, was prepared in 1964. Now, what the position of the colonial office it becomes interesting. Where do they stand on these things? The first thing is that London realized that changes would have to come. And one of the interesting things that happens in the 1960s, early 1960s, is the pressure from the UN Committee on Decolonization, Committee of 24. And Fiji is frequently mentioned in deliberations on decolonization throughout the world in this period. So they know that they have to move, but the question really is, can they? And how they should do this, because they had to bear in mind the interests and concerns and pressure from Fijian chiefs, and that weighs very heavily on the minds of officials in London. Now, so one issue until the mid-1960s is the pace of change. Fijians make change, go slow. Indians welcoming change towards internal self-governance and independence. That was one issue that divided the communities in Fiji. The second issue, which aroused great passion at that time, was whether Fiji should have a common roll system of elections or communal role. In other words, whether you should have a race-based system or a non-racial system. Now, Fijian chiefs were very, very, very clear that they are the ones, Fijian people must choose Fijian representatives to represent them in the Legislative Council. They could not trust others, in quotes, to represent them. This was the way things had been done in Fiji for hundreds of years. So that's one position. The other one from the Indian community was that they ought to have strive for common rule. In other words, a non-racial system of voting. And this had been their platform since 1929, when the first 3 members were elected to the Legislative Council, and in fact, when the demand was not accepted, they boycotted the Legislative Council. It's a long-standing demand that the Fiji must strive to have a non-racial political culture rather than a race-based political culture. So there are 2 issues that produce a lot of heated discussion: pace of change and this whole question of whether it should be common rule or communal rule. Now, it is at this time, when opinions are so polarized, that Britain decides to hold Fiji's first constitutional conference, and that is in July 1965 at Marlborough House in London. Again, it's interesting, the statement of the 3 communities, 3 groups at the conference. Ratumara, who was then emerging as the leader of the Fijian people and Fijian delegation in London, said that he saw no sound of good reason, and I'm quoting him, saw no sound of good reason to attenuate, let alone sever, our happy and historic relations with the UK. We see absolutely no reason. But that, if you're going to move ahead, then please consult us and indeed seek our consent before moving forward. So that's the Fijian position, which is similar to the one that they articulated in the Wakaya letter in 1964. European delegation spokesperson was John Falvey, who again said that, the people he represented saw absolutely no reason to have any change in Fiji's relations with the UK. But that if change was to come, then there has to be some form of, his words, association with the UK. And this is something that is, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned, is also in the Wakaya letter, where it said that, Fiji should, or UK should consider relations with Fiji along the lines of relations they had with Channel Islands and with Isle of Man. Basically, what it meant was, in matters of defense, immigration, and so on, UK would have responsibility, but in matters of internal governance, Fiji would have its autonomy. And this is what Falvey is saying as well. The Indian position, the delegation led by A.G. Patel, differed completely. What he said was that Fiji is ready for independence, and that he hoped that the 1965 Constitutional Conference would be the first step to mark the, and I quote him, the end of a form of government that stands universally condemned in the modern world. Universally condemned in the modern world, beginning towards independence. And again, common rule should be the basis of elections in Fiji. Now, the British, and by then, you see, there have been huge discussions in London among colonial officials. And there was division of opinion. Now, in the early years, they said, look, we can't really have the Fijian people exercise a power of veto over any constitutional development. I mean, we have to look at the interests of the colony as a whole. And I think ideologically, intellectually, they're convinced that common rule or non-racialism was something to be, or it was something desirable. But the reality on the ground was something else. And that was that Fijian position had to be appreciated. Because after all, they were the majority of the security forces, as I think Julian Emery said in his dispatch, in his report to London. And the Fijians were the loyal race. I mean, they had fought alongside the British in the Solomon Islands in World War II. That fought in the jungles of Malaysia against Chinese in communist insurgents and so on. And the third argument was that, look, these people were the ones who ceded Fiji to us in the first place. And we cannot, in good conscience, ignore that fact. And by the mid-1960s, the British position is very clear. That it's not articulated, but you can see in the secret records in London that no, we should strive for a solution that is on surface appears to be genuine parliamentary democracy, based on democratic values, but that leaves Fijian people in control, in the driver's seat. So you have an overarching structure of democratic governance, but in such a way that Fijian people would come out on top. That was their thinking. And in a way, the 1965 Constitution Conference brought about that outcome. Okay, Indians and Fijians had equal number of seats in the Legislative Council, but Europeans were overrepresented. And it was, everyone knew that Europeans would go along with Fijians. So therefore, they will have, larger numbers of representatives in the Legislative Council. And European representation is something that Tumara and Fijians insist on. The other interesting thing is that for the first time, the Great Council of Chiefs is allowed to have two of its nominees sitting in the Legislative Council, which is fully elected, and you have two nominees. This is a kind of a sop to the idea of Fijian paramountcy that was in the minds of many people. And the third thing they did was to say, look, they rejected common rule as the form of electing parliament or legislative council. And so, in a sense, it's interesting. It's interesting in the sense that, you see, Europeans and Fijians had common rule, except the Indians. This way, you see, Chinese were put on European rule, so they could, fine. And then on the Fijian rule, you had Pacific Islanders and Retumans. It was the Indians who were the ones who were left in a totally communal setup. Anyway, that was the constitution, the result of the constitutional conference, and a new constitution was passed. But the feeling in London was, but that this was going to last for 10 years or so before the next constitutional conference will be held, and hopefully Fiji would move towards independence. But after giving the constitution, the 1966 constitution, a try for a year, the Federation Party walked out of Parliament, of Legislative Council on September 1967. And there's a by-election in 1968. And it was a very, very tense affair, Riots were threatened. Threatening noises were made about deporting people, and so on. But the result of the Federation Party's position by now was Fiji ought to have complete independence. Complete independence like Australia and New Zealand, a dominion in the Commonwealth, and on the basis of common law. The result of the elections were that the National Federation Party, or Federation Party as it then was returned to the Legislative Council with increased majorities. So 75% of the Indian communal votes went to the Federation Party on its platform of independence, a new constitution, common law, and so on. The message went out that, unlike 1965, this voice could not be ignored. And now this was discussed more and more in the UN and other places. So the second one was the Fijian leaders realized they could not hold out forever. That they had a majority in the Legislative Council, and that they should take the lead. And this was the advice given to them also by a group called the Fijian Graduates Group, which consisted of people like Dr. Lucia Tinadekalo and others. That you cannot hold out forever, seize independence while you're still ahead. The British government was said, look, we will discuss this at the next constitutional conference, which was held in 1969. In 1969, the last one, 65. 4 years later, you have a new constitutional conference. What changed things? 69 was the conference. In 1970, Fiji becomes independent. Now, what changed the dynamics was the death on October 1, 1969, of A.D. Patel. A.D. Patel died, and he was succeeded by Siddiq Koya, who had been his lieutenant throughout the 1960s. And I don't think that Siddiq Koya fully supported the idea of common role, because by then the Federation Party had also fallen into the trap, or not trap, but the thing that they could only trust their own kind to represent them in Parliament. He told Lord Shepherd, who was the parliamentary and the secretary for Commonwealth Affairs, he was the one negotiating this, that look, if you mention that common role is our long-term objective, I'll be happy. Which was a complete, complete disregard of the party's position throughout the 1960s. They also proposed an upper house. An upper house, there is the Senate, where Fijian chiefs would be given the power of veto over any legislation that even remotely affected Fijian interests. All those legislations about titles, land, and so on and so forth. Hoping that by doing that, they'll open up more space for democratic debate in the lower house. So with all these concessions, and NFP was in a mood, in a concession giving mood, the deep issues that had divided the three different communities had disappeared. And the interesting thing is this, you see, that the 1970 Constitution, the Independence Constitution, is in effect an extension of the 1966 Constitution. the same common role, communal role, some cross-voting and so on. But it is an extension of the 1966 Constitution, over which NFP had fought a bitter by-election in 1968. So, you know, the whole question of method of election was shelved aside with the provision that after independence, there will be a royal commission appointed to look into this and make recommendations. A royal commission was appointed in 1975 under the chairmanship of Sir Harry Street, and it made recommendations for STV proportional representation to represent the 1970 provision. But the interesting thing is that report was tabled in Parliament but never debated. Never debated. There was no motion on the part of the NFP to debate it, and of course the Alliance Party, having one power, didn't want to debate it at all. So these were issues which sort of underlay the 1970 Constitution, unresolved. That is, the system, the voting, nothing about leasing of land, legislation, and so on and so forth. Now, Tumara was assured by David Butler of Nuffield College, Oxford, that if Fijians remain united, they will rule for a very, very long time. And the way the system was organized, this race becomes the pillar of this constitution. But very soon afterwards, in 1976, we find out that 25% of indigenous Fijians voted not for Atumara's party, but for Sakiasi Butundroka. And you have fragmentation in the 1980s, Western United Front, and many other political parties emerging in the 1990s. So the idea of racial unity that underpinned the arrangement proved to be fraught. Also, because the Atumara and the Alliance Party realized that to be in power, they had to keep all the Fijians on side. Understandable given the logic of the 1970 Constitution. But that also meant the drift away from alliance of Indian members. In 1972 elections, fully 24% of Indians, and prominent Indians at that, had supported the Alliance Party. But by the 1970s, they're all gone. They're all gone to the opposition National Federation Party. So you have greater and greater polarization, and the result, of course, was the 1987 coup, when the assumptions and understandings that underpin the 1970 Constitution were overturned. Now, we come to the 2013. I'm conscious of time. 2013 Constitution. Interestingly, it's been decreed, but not debated or discussed by people. So we have a constitution that is decreed, and two elections have been held under it, and a strange Dion system which many people don't understand. Then the most important thing about this constitution is, again, people don't realize, is the power of the military, the guardian role given to the military, not to the parliament. The parliament doesn't decide if the constitution is in danger. It's the military who not only enforces popular will, but interprets it as well. And I would argue that this is the time bomb that lies buried in Fiji's present constitution, and I hope that it will be diffused before it is too late. I'm sorry I've spoken for longer than I had planned, but thank you very much for listening.